I'd like to begin my presentation with a simple question. Which of the following are JRPGs? All are clearly RPGs. They have all the bells and whistles of the genre: randomness, quantification of character, a leveling system. But some would further say a few of these are clearly JRPGs, Japanese role-playing games, a common fan term used to describe the gaming experiences players encounter when playing certain titles from Japan. So now for the more difficult question. What accounts for this distinction? Why are some games mere RPGs while others are graced with an additional adjective? And why don't we speak of PRPGs or even GRPGs? For fans, JRPGs tend to be framed as a foil to Western role-playing games, locating the differences between the two in some alchemical arrangement of narrative, aesthetic, and ludic properties. While video game historian Matt Barton references these as elements of the genre, he also argues that understanding JRPGs necessitates charting the country's political, ideological, and cultural currents. If the examples I began this presentation with are RPGs because they share certain gaming mechanics compositional to role-playing games, what makes them Japanese is plausibly located elsewhere. While I think the ways fans conceptualize JRPGs are useful, they tend to downplay the material conditions that contribute to the formation of culture and the role media play in this formation. To that end, I take Barton's suggestion to heart and want to propose an alternative way to conceptualize JRPGs based on their relationships to other creative media, one wherein consumption across these media generate discourses of Japan and its culture. This approach in many ways supports the content-oriented descriptions fans have sketched by offering explanations as to why certain aesthetic or narrative features help define the genre. The first point useful in positioning JRPGs in this fashion is the theory of the media mix. So what exactly is it? Well, at the heart of the media mix are relationships. Characters and the worlds they inhabit are developed across media with the goal of creating a media world wherein the consumption of one element drives the consumption of others. The touch of the media mix can be easily seen in JRPGs through DLC. Often, properties from one game or series appear as skins in the others. Underlying these processes is Eiji Otsuka's theory of narrative consumption. Rather than emphasizing the structural networks linking media objects together, narrative consumption, as the name implies, focuses on the role stories play in driving the consumption of discrete media. Motivating this consumption is the character-world relationship, where a grand narrative or worldview structures how smaller narrative or worldview segments fit together. In other words, what consumers actually buy is not the media object itself, but rather the intangible story fragment the object houses. So how do the theories of the media mix and narrative consumption apply to the circulation of culture and what constitutes JRPGs? I think one answer emerges if we treat culture as created through a similar character-world relationship, one wherein representations across individual media texts, cultural fragments, fit together to construct a grand narrative of Japan and its culture. Doing so naturally treats culture as a commodity, and the role media play in this commodification has had a long and often sordid history in critical theory. In Japan, the concept of Kawaii, or cute, serves as one example of this commodification. In speaking of Hello Kitty, McVeigh argues that central to commodification is the investment of discourses of cuteness in a variety of forms across material objects. Cuteness can be seen in phone straps, in dolls, in stickers, and much, much more, but also within creative media such as JRPGs, anime, and manga. While visual tropes such as big eyes, small size, or roundness are often seen as markers of kawaii, in the book Cute Theory, Inohiko Yomota notes that cuteness is made up of more than visual elements. behavior forms a core part of cuteness in Japan. Azuma's theory of the database complicates things by noting that individual behavioral or visual tropes are combined and recombined to produce different representations of cuteness. In short, the diverse ways in which kawaii can be expressed ensures that no one example is representative of the whole. It functions across media in multiple ways, with no specific game or anime containing representations of all possibilities. As a result, in order to complete the kawaii narrative, or to borrow a turn of phrase from Pokemon, to catch 'em all, fans must constantly pursue and consume representations in other media, JRPGs or otherwise, to make sure their account matches that of the larger whole. Parallel to the theory of narrative consumption, the cultural narrative can never be completed because the creative industries are constantly releasing new products which tap into and redefine how the discourse is articulated. I want to call this process the cultural media mix. In the case of Japan, the government plays an active role in which cultural fragments gets promoted by using them in soft political campaigns. Since 2009, for example, the Cool Japan campaign has used kawaii in a variety of ways to promote interest in the country. So, how does the government do this, and what are the consequences? The answers to these questions are probably best demonstrated through the words of government officials and industry insiders themselves. Kenjiro Monji, the former Director General of the Public Diplomacy Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, notes that, quote, "The wellspring of soft power lies in the private sector, so any attempts to exercise this power at the national level should be premised on working closely with the private sector." Jun Takeuchi, General Manager of Capcom's R&D Strategic Planning Department, and Kazuhiko Tsutsumi of NHK Enterprises, explains the logistics of this from the creative media side. In speaking of game design, Takeuchi says that, quote, "Because we market our video games to people from countries throughout the world, there's this assumption that we design them on the basis of appealing to everyone everywhere. But that's actually not the case. We make a conscious effort to create video games that will introduce foreign gamers to uniquely Japanese concepts and sensibilities." Tsutsumi notes that the process applies equally to media imported into Japan. He says that, quote, "When Japan imports something from overseas, adjustments are made to cater to Japanese tastes. These twists strike foreigners as being very Japanese and very cool." There is an assumption, then, that Japanese creative media somehow embody elements of the culture. This invests production location with an implicit cultural dimension that, for better or for worse, and probably worse, taps into Orientalist discourses of the country's cultural uniqueness. So how does this impact JRPGs? Once again, DLC provides a potential answer. In terms of the cultural media mix, the significance of DLC lies with its potential to restructure the gaming experience based on a player's familiarity with Japanese cultural flows. One of these flows, as I mentioned before, is that of kawaii or cute. Consider the following examples taken from the game Tales of Grace's F.
俺たちは負けないしくじけないし倒れないし揃わなくても泣かないし俺たちは負けないしくじけないし倒れないし揃わなくても泣かないし
One hallmark of the Tales series is that of after-battle dialogue. After each victory, the characters who participated in the battle interact with each other and offer comments about the difficulty or ease of the battle. But DLC can change these dynamics. As a general practice, costumes do not alter in any significant way the gameplay or narrative of their respective games. Rather, the ability of these costumes to restructure a player's gaming experience stems from their semiotic connections to other games. In speaking of the relationships between narrative and game structuring, Yule mentions that while narratives and gameplay across players of the same game will be roughly similar, well, except localization issues, which is a matter for another time, the interpretation or framing of these elements will vary. Multiple players playing the same game, then, will interpret it differently based on their individual configuration of the gaming elements. In this case, the addition of the idol costumes produces not only a different visual approach to the after-battle dialogue, but it also taps into a broader network regarding idol culture and behavior. It is also reminiscent of the Japanese phenomenon of purikura, photo booths that allow people to alter the photographs taken of them by adding frames, sparkles, and a host of other aesthetic choices. The point I wish to emphasize here is that DLC enables players to draw from and engage with the various narratives about Japan and its culture. It offers a platform from which players can experiment with cultural tropes linked across Japanese media and expressed in soft political exercises like Cool Japan. In so doing, DLC offers a digital modification to the interplay McLuhan states is essential to games. What I have sketched in this presentation in many ways reflects McLuhan's position. But rather than solely focusing on players and their interactions with games or among each other, the growing role industrial and governmental actors play in this field asks that we examine the ways in which they impact contemporary media ecologies. The Cool Japan campaign, and more broadly exercises of soft power in Japan, offers one example of this impact by linking where a product is produced with cultural production. For games, one relevant consequence of this conflation is the opportunity for subgenres based on perceived cultural characteristics to be carved from within existing genres. This further helps explain why JRPGs are a distinct genre, while the Witcher or Gothic series are not described as PRPGs or GRPGs, despite the fact that Polish and German cultures, the last time I checked, are distinct from French or Swedish or American ones. All of these have their own robust gaming industries, but with the exception of America, all tend to lack the connections across creative media that define the media mix, let alone the broader ecologies that constitute the cultural media mix. In sum, JRPGs are JRPGs not just because of the distinctive characteristics fans identify, their narrative, aesthetic, and ludic traits, but also because the representations in these elements resonate across other creative media. As such, they are components in a larger system of relations that help define, rightly or wrongly, what constitutes Japan and its culture.